And we have I'm delighted to introduce a fantastic panel today. I think you'll enjoy today's conversations. We have from Cambridge Consultants, we have Yan-Lin Lai, who heads MedTech for Cambridge Consultants based here in Singapore. We are very honored to have Rahul Sathe join from Cambridge Consultants Boston office, and he is the Vice President Surgical Innovation at Cambridge Consultants. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Langston Swan, who is based in Hong Kong, Chief Executive and founder of Opharmic Technology, and the winner of MedTech Innovators Asia Pacific competition in 2021. Langston, welcome back. And welcome Yan-Lin and Rahul. I'll have each of our panelists introduce themselves in just a moment. Quick reminder to our cohort companies, just rename yourselves so that we have your name and your company. We are live streaming this on YouTube, so warm welcome to our YouTube viewers as well. And the way this will work is we'll do our panel discussion for the next 60 minutes or so. We'll then part ways with our YouTube viewers, and we'll continue and have 30 minutes of closed door Q&A just with the 20 companies in our cohort. So again, warm welcome everyone. Let me then begin by having everyone briefly introduce themselves, tell us a bit about your company and your role, and I guess ladies first. So Yan-Lin.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Yan-Lin. I am head of MedTech here in APAC, so I work in the Singapore office. And what we do as a company is we're a 60-year-old product development firm. We have about 900 scientists, engineers, consultants, designers, full-time in-house globally. And our bread and butter is helping our clients accelerate towards product. So we help even early stage technologies like Opharmic identify the challenges that they have in their journey towards product development and help them get through those challenges as quickly as possible. So I represent all of our business in the MedTech arena in the APAC region. But my colleague Rahul, he'll introduce himself in a second, but he's much more focused in one of our specific areas, which is surgical. And I know this year we have quite a lot of surgical companies in this year's cohort, so I'm very excited to have him on and share his knowledge with us.
Great, thank you for that, Yan-Lin. And Rahul, over to you.
Great, thanks Yan-Lin, thanks Frederick, glad to be here. Good morning, Rahul Sathe. I head our global surgery business, which comprises of smart implants, surgical robotics, navigation, visualization systems, digital surgery platforms, and advanced critical care equipment. And as Yan-Lin mentioned, we help clients transform the future of surgery by developing complex systems from concept all the way through to launch. My own personal background is nearly 20 years of R&D leadership across many clinical areas. I started my career backwards, actually in implant manufacturing, moved into development, then design, then strategy, M&A, and now head our commercial business. So very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Rahul. And just before I hand over to Langston, I should also say, for those of you who are not aware, we're very fortunate to have had Cambridge Consultants as our partner and sponsor organization now in the second year. Opharmic Technology was, in fact, the winner not only of the grand prize last year, but of the Cambridge Consultants Design and Development Award, and we'll talk a bit more about that in just a minute. So great to have both Yan-Lin and Rahul here on the webinar. So Langston, over to you. Tell us a bit about yourself, what Opharmic does, and then we can dive into your relationship with Cambridge Consultants a little bit later.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Langston. I'm founder and CEO of Opharmic. So at Opharmic, we developed the novel ultrasound technology specifically for drug delivery purposes. And our first area of focus is actually in the eye care space. And we actually do so by partnering with like-minded pharma companies, and we contribute our delivery technology and work with specific drugs that the like-minded pharma partners have to create combination products for specific indications. So right now we have several partnerships in place targeting different indications around the eye. And I'm glad to share more experience about how we transform such innovations from our university research as viable products in a bit.
Great, thanks very much, Langston. So maybe let me turn to Jan-Lin first, and it'd be good to have your thoughts on when we talk about emerging growth companies, what typically are some of the compelling reasons for them to outsource product design and engineering as opposed to develop in-house?
Sometimes it's just very practical. You could build everything in-house, but as we all know, it takes time to do so. And sometimes it doesn't make sense to wait 6 months, 12 months, even 18 months to find the right talent to bring into your team in order to continue your product development journey. So one of the ways that firms like ours helps is we already have the teams. So you can accelerate growth by basically tapping into that resource while you build your company. So it's quite common that we would start a program and we might take, a significant chunk of it at the very beginning because the startup has a very small core team. But over the period of the project, the startup grows. And then we do less and less until at the very end, we do very, very little, if anything at all. And that basically means you can continue to do product development without having to wait for human resource, I should say. The other thing as well is sometimes there are skills that you may not need all the time. So you may just need that, core human factors engineer or that algorithm specialist for a few months at a time. And it may not be worthwhile to keep them on staff, for the whole journey that you're on. So if it's not core to your product and it's sort of like a one-off skill set that you need to employ now and then, that's also another good reason to outsource some of the work. Well, that's sort of very much on the practical side of things, but in sort of the big picture reasons, some of the top reasons why people come to firms like ours is because we've done it a lot. This is our bread and butter. We do 400 or 500 projects a year. We have hundreds of projects that have gone through regulatory. So other than just thinking of us as, hands to do work, it's the experience and know-how that comes with it to say, okay, let's get you through this as quickly, as efficiently as possible, as much as possible first time right, because we have the experience to say, that's going to work, that's probably not going to work. So how can we do the best trade-offs for your company? So getting us early to have those discussions, to plan, your journey can be even very helpful, even if we don't play a huge part in actual execution of that program. So yeah, these are just some of the reasons why folks like working to us.
That's very helpful, Jan-Lin, and it's good that sort of you've set the stage here and people understand how you can add value in the product development process. So let me turn back to Langston, and as we mentioned earlier, you not only won the main prize last year, but you also won the Cambridge Consultants Product Design and Development Award. Tell us a little bit about that receiving that award and how your work that you did with Cambridge Consultants has impacted Opharmic. And I guess for the cohort that are on the call or on the webinar this morning, what should the winner be expecting?
Yeah, so I would say last year's Cambridge Consultant Product Development Award is definitely, I would say, a very important milestone for us because that actually gets us into a stage where we have to really have a deeper dive to our existing product development efforts. And in order for us to really align our efforts and resources to pursue our business, meaning the licensing business with pharma companies, how should we streamline the subsequent or future work on product side in order to really win business and have success on that front? So we actually have a very lengthy discussion with Cambridge Consultants as to what what should be the areas of focus for that award in order to really see what are the key pain points that we should address with, say, subject matter experts like Cambridge consultants, to move forward. And I think after discussion, we both agree human factors is actually one of the key areas that worth augmenting based on what we have from our existing product development efforts. And I think that has been quite rewarding because through that's actually quite a long process, and a team of Cambridge consultants very really involved in the process as well. Throughout the 3-month engagement, we actually identified several key areas where the human factor aspects can actually be augmented through significant design revisions and reviews. So I think we are now basically targeting these directions to see how we can streamline the whole process as to how doctors will be using Opharmic system to replacing eye injection to get the drugs in the eye with our novel technology. So my advice for this year's cohort, I think if you're very honored to be selected as the product development award winner this year, be prepared. There will be some disruption to say how you see your current product development plan, and I think it's a good one because obviously, like Yan mentioned, which I echo a lot. Sometimes you feel you can do a lot of things internally, but there will be some time down the road that you have to make a decision whether you want to really leapfrog and outsource certain part of the work for efficiency, and also to really help you as the management of the company to focus what you need to do to really grow the business rather than just spending 80% of your time assemble the right product team and wrestling on a lot of technical issues. So I think there might be some sort of changes and disruptions, but I think that would be a good one, and that should hopefully get you to a better next stage for a product development cycle as well.
Great, that's good to hear, Langston. And for our cohort companies, many of you will in fact be mentored by senior executives from Cambridge consultants, including Yan Lin and including Rahul. And thank you both for doing that. So you'll have an opportunity to get to know the organization better. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Cambridge consultants is contributing with the greatest number of mentors for our cohort this year of any of our corporate partners. So we're delighted to have that support. Rahul, before we go into some technical details here, what, from your experience having worked with clients in surgical innovation and possibly in other areas, are some of the key qualities in a great relationship between a startup and a product design contractor? What are those dynamics and what makes that work?
That's a fantastic question. The word partnership comes to mind first and foremost. We're very privileged to work with some of the world's largest healthcare companies as well as two-person startups, and a strong sense of partnership and a shared mission for what the product is trying to do, what impact that company is trying to make on patients and the healthcare system. That's really important, and that partnership takes time. So having multiple conversations to understand where is our client or potential client in their business cycle, what are the gaps that their organization has, where do we drive high value, where do they actually need a different sort of partner within our network or a different contract manufacturer. So it's just having the open, honest conversations up front about what is trying to be achieved, how the different entities can partner together. So that's great on the philosophical side, but on the practical side, right? Thinking about teaming is really important. Many startups fall into the easy trap of hiring a skill set as opposed to thinking about what their product architecture might be and then thinking about where the right splits are in the architecture. So for example, having one entity do hardware and another entity do software often doesn't make sense. It makes sense to think about systems and subsystems and ecosystems, and then figuring out where the right partition is, and then figuring out what organization can support which part of that architecture.
Great feedback. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Rahul. Yan Lin, some common avoidable mistakes that you've come across that startups typically make when it comes to product design and engineering? What have you seen, and what are some of the issues that can ultimately come back and hurt those companies further down the road?
Yeah, I think one of the common mistakes is people think a working prototype is a product. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of drive towards creating something physical that then you can, sort of hold up and say, this is my product. Those kind of things are useful, and they do have an engineering purpose in terms of de-risking parts of the program. And yeah, they're great for fundraising because investors love things that they can touch and feel.
True.
But the thing is, there's a really big difference between something that works and something that is a medical product that you can get through regulatory, right? And so one of the misconceptions is, if I make it and it works, I should be able to backfill the documentation in order to get through regulatory. And that's just not true. Because you shouldn't really think about it as, oh, it's documentation. Actually, what the regulators are looking for is how you're thinking about it. Mm-hmm. It's actually a process. Yeah. So in like the most basic sense, what the regulators want to see and what the QMS and what the ISO 13485 standards are for is to sort of guide you through a process and sort of like an expectation. So part one, you say what you're going to build and why. So that's your intended statements. And you sort of say, this is the thing that I hope to achieve. It's going to be safe and effective for this type of patient to cure this kind of disease, right? Mm-hmm. Part two, you do the work. And that's, everything from architecture, detailed design, the rest of it. And until you have something physical that hopefully you can say, okay, it meets those requirements. But then part three is proving that you meet those requirements. So that's the verification and validation steps, right? So it's basically saying the end product matches the thing that I intended to build at the very start of the program. So if you skip all that planning steps and you just say, okay, I'm just gonna tinker with it until it works, you have no traceability, and you actually have no idea whether you're meeting all the standards or not, because you never looked up the standards to begin with in the starting place. So what ends up happening is, I unfortunately have spoken to many startups where they say, hey, I told my investors I'm 4 months from submission, CE mark, FDA, CFDA, whatever. My prototype works. And then I say, okay, great. Are you, are you ISO 13485 certified? Do you have your QMS system? Let's check through your traceability. Like, do you have everything? Oh, I don't have a QMS system. I'm not ISO 13485. Then what do you have? What you have is a prototype. It's not a product. And unfortunately, what that means is a lot of times you have to go back and rework a lot of things, because some of those things, you can sort of, if it's small problems, you can sort of backfill a little bit. But if you have nothing to begin with and you didn't do any of that planning, it's unfortunately quite often a start again. Mm. It's not a minor tweak to your documentation to get it through regulatory. It's a start again. And that really, cripples companies, because they've effectively expectation managed the investors and the stakeholders to say, oh, I'm 4 months out, but actually they're 2 years out. Mm. And that really then starts devaluing the company, and it goes into a negative spiral. So that's something that really folks should avoid, and to not think about, regulatory standards and QMSs as just documentation. It's actually there to help you run a good program, and help you tailor how you think about doing product development. Yeah.
I think that's great feedback, and I think let's talk a little bit about regulatory in a bit more detail. So typically, Jan-Lin, then when should a startup plan for implementing a QMS and get their regulatory act together? Is that really from day one, when the company is set up, the moment they start doing any form of product design and development work?
There's usually a phase that you can get away with not doing a QMS, and we call that skunks works. And that's literally the very early phase. Is this possible to do? You know, so you're literally just tinkering to see, am I breaking laws of physics? You know,
Right.
is this even possible? But once you get past that point and you say, oh, okay, it is possible, then you probably really should start thinking about getting a QMS in place and, you know, thinking about getting your site certified, because those, you know, to get ISO 13485 certification, you know, it can take 4 to 6 months. Because it's not just on your timeline, you have to get auditors in, right? So if you don't need that day one, but you need that in 6 months, you probably should start now, basically. So no, you don't have to do everything within, you know, the regulatory context at the early stage. But once you have something that you think, oh, this could be a product, then you really need to start transitioning into a more regulatory framework, basically, so that you don't have to redo stuff.
Yeah, great point. Quick reminder to our cohort, there will be a whole separate webinar on the regulatory topic, so we will come back to that. Also, if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So again, following up on QMS, Langston, what were some of the learnings at Opharmic Technology as you were building your QMS, and at what point in time did you do that?
Oh, thank you. Well, as a matter of fact, we are actually in the thick of ISO 13485 audits as of now. So I definitely echo what Yan-Lin said about, like, you know, the process and the correct mindset of how one startup company should see implementing QMS. Frankly, our product development journey pretty much resembles, in some cases, what Yan-Lin just described. Because my technology was based on my previous university research. I've been spending more than 10 years developing the ultrasound technology. So obviously we have that stage of really to see whether this is something feasible to build as like a working prototype to show to stakeholders, including investors, doctors, patients, to convey the message. So that stage I will describe more like a honeymoon, because exactly like Yan mentioned, which I definitely agree, at that stage, you don't need a QMS in place. But when we notice we already overcome certain technical challenges in terms of how to, say, make some sort of critical parts, then we realize we need to really make it a real product. And in terms of timing, that come in very, perfectly, because that idea of starting to really set up a QMS came through during the accelerator cohort last year, when I was interacting with one of the Cambridge consultants' mentor, Isabel. I think she and I, we have a very long sessions about, like, how to really see QMS system in a more proper way and how to implement it. And right after the 2 sessions that I have with the mentor, I decided that it's the right time to implement it. And the process is not easy, obviously, because there's a lot of guidelines you have to solve through and understand, and it takes us more than 8 months to start from scratch. And a QMS is not something that, you just get some sort of templates, record sheets available, and you say you are compliant with that system. So you have to really think carefully and creatively how to really use a QMS system to achieve what you want from a business perspective. So we actually have to build all these SOPs and also all the subsequent, say, records, instructions by ourselves in a way that fits us, because it's impossible you impose a ton of paperwork to a team maybe that's 12 or 15 strong. So it will really get your team just wrestling with all these paperwork without doing the actual work to really get your company to grow. So I would say it's a very rewarding process, and I think that the timing that we decide to implement QMS was very, very interesting, in very perfect timing as well. And I would definitely encourage, if you already have some sort of working prototypes in place and you feel satisfied, that's the time that you have to start thinking about how to bring that as a product, and that's where the QMS should be coming in.
Great point, Langston. Thanks for that. I know that amongst the the companies in our cohort listening in on the webinar, some have ISO 13485 already in place in a QMS, some do not. So I think they can all identify with that. So Rahul, design control, of course, is an integral part of ISO 13485. Cambridge Consultant, you're not primarily a regulatory consultant, though. So to what extent do you support your clients in this arena? And I assume you work with clients that are both post ISO 13485 and pre 13485. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure, and maybe just to share the lens from the experience that our teams have. So in the medical devices arena, we've helped probably over 1 million patients now with procedures, with implants, multiple dozen FDA cleared CE mark devices, and have worked with hundreds of surgeons and so many different QMS systems from clients. And through all that experience, I think there's a recurring theme here, which is, and I think Langston hit it really well, finding the fit for purpose QMS system for that particular business is really important. I think many companies struggle with QMS because they treat it as a hindrance, when actually if it's done well, it's best practice. It's the fastest, most efficient way to get your product to market and increase your likelihood of adoption, market penetration, sales growth, increased valuation, especially if you might be partnering with a strategic that might be investing or helping an exit. Those are really important things that a strategic will be looking for. And so back to your question, Frederick, clients that are pre-1345, we do engage with some of those clients because they may be embarking on a very early journey for establishing feasibility. A smart implant, a class 3 implant, say in the cardiovascular space that has closed loop control or sensing. Those are 7 to 10 year development programs, typically hundreds of millions by the time you get through clinical trials for an IDE. So there will naturally be a year or two of feasibility, skunkworks, pre-1345. So we do work with those companies that are seeking to completely disrupt clinical practice. But then we also find that the discipline of establishing that QMS, right sizing it for the company, and also growing that QMS over time, thinking about design controls, not just from requirements, but also manufacturability, process control, process development, way downstream. Those are all really important factors. So again, we're not regulatory consultants in the sense of help clients just submit to regulators, but we do have a function internal to our organization where on every project team, we have some regulatory specialist who helps make sure he or she represents that thinking early as well as all the way through the process.
Great point. Thanks, Rahul. Let's talk now about UX, UI design, user experience, user interface design. And this is actually a question from our cohort. We do survey our cohort participants before we start the webinar series, and this was something that had come up a couple of times. What should a medtech or a health tech startup consider in the area of UX, UI design? In fact, what's the difference between the two? And how can a startup obtain early feedback on their UX, UI design in a most cost-effective way? And maybe I'll stay with Rahul on this first, and then I'll go to Jan-Lin.
Sure. So there's not really a difference in UI, UX. It's really a terminology around how any user might interface with a medical device. So that user might be a patient. It might be a physician. It might be an entire surgical team if it's a surgical robotic system. So you've got 12 to 15 people who are preparing pre-op, intra-op, post-op. It might be back-end IT administrators who are helping to gather some of the patient data to do analysis. It could be caregivers. And so the important thing there is, as a company designs a medical device, being upfront about the intended use. Who is going to use that device? How are they going to use it? Where in the care pathway? What are the potential interaction points? What are the use-related risks that might arise from using that product, either by misuse or unintentional use? So it's definitely thinking about the risks involved, and then having the right disciplines in place early on to do the right ethnographic research, formative user research, usability studies along the way, and human factors validation testing. Now, back to the question of UI, UX. So there may be displays that display information. There are ways to mock that up early in feasibility, where you don't need a fully functional prototype. Those can be mocked up by screen displays, flashcards. And in fact, we often advocate that companies don't try to test the finished prototype with users, but they decompose the usability interaction points. So you may have a dozen different ways to probe with users. How does that screen display look? Is it presenting the right information? How would you interpret that information? If it's a physical prototype, how might that user set interact with it? And there's a whole scientific discipline around the art of using devices, human factors engineering. So we employ close to 30 HF specialists in our teams. And again, we make sure they're part of that multidisciplinary product development process. And that makes sure you've got a cost-effective, efficient development pathway, because you're de-risking usability every step along the way.
Right, and maybe thanks for that, Rahul. That's great. Langston, how has Opharmic technology navigated this, and to what extent have you worked on UX, UI design and testing in your product?
Well, I mean, human factor is one, I gotta admit, it's very important aspects of device development journey. In our early stage, when we try to determine the feasibility of our, say, working prototypes, we actually set a focus group comprising patients, doctors in Hong Kong, in European regions, and in US as well, through our advisors network, to get early feedback in terms of how they typically perform, say, eye injections in their day-to-day work. And we also, say, do some sort of scenario play. And in a sense, if we have this sort of a solutions using ultrasound device as a non-invasive mean to deliver drugs, so how would they envision it? And we also describe the process that we were envisioning, and what are the key areas or key points of interactions that doctors foresee, and what are the preferred features that they have. So these are like the early efforts that we have in terms of gathering information and insights of how end users, including patients and doctors, would imagine, like, the best case scenario, how our ultrasound device would be used. But to some extent, when we want to tie this sort of insights information and to integrate into our product development work, not just by making workable prototypes, but to become actual products, this is where we also start reorganizing our resources by identifying more experienced ODMs or design partners, so that we can really go back to drawing board and say, these are the key, say, features or key aspects that the users expect to see. And technically, we already achieved these sort of achievements. So how do we marry the two, so that we don't just get a device that's functionally all fine, but say, when it comes to interacting with users, it's like a terrible nightmare. So that's the last thing that we want. So I think the product development award that we got last year, and through working with Cambridge Consultant in the short-term projects, that actually start shaping these sort of discussion and the strategies on how to marry the two in a very effective way. And right now we're also having separate discussion and to see how we can turn those findings that we have about, like, say, say the preferences of the users expect to see in our product versus what we have been offering so far as a working prototype. So how to bridge the gaps through a redesign effort. So we are having separate discussion on that, and hopefully we'll have a more refined device that has a more pleasant UX UI experience shortly. Yeah. So it is a process, I gotta say, but I think from a startup perspective, obviously resources is a bit of a constraint. So do leverage your advisors network, maybe through advisors of connections, and try to tap into different territories as well. Because even say for eye injections, we noticed the practices in US, Europe, and Hong Kong could slightly different. So these will be very important UX UI insights that you can factor in earlier when you try to chart out how you should just develop your product development journey.
Great point, Langston. Thanks for that. And just a final comment, maybe from Yan-Lin on usability testing. And yeah, you put up your hand as well, so I'll let you comment then without me asking a question.
Yeah. So I think missing out on human factor studies is one of the common mistakes I also see in startups.
Yeah.
Because they think that, oh, I talked to the one surgeon that I've been working with for the past year, and therefore I can just write down what they say, and that can be my human factors input, basically, or my user requirements. And then they go off on this product development journey based on that one input. And as Langston alluded to, that may not be true, because that's one perspective, and surgical procedures may be different country to country. Standards of practice are different country to country. And if you didn't know that, you're going to develop product that doesn't make sense for the geographies that you're actually targeting. But separate from that as well, going back to the regulatory standard, there are requirements to do this work. And they are quite strict in that they are inputs to your overall design. So if you didn't have this input and you went off on this journey, when you get to the end, they're going to say, oh, but you missed out this whole big category of inputs. So your design has not considered the user at all. And then it becomes a start again. And that's definitely something you want to avoid. So there are very practical, good, just, best practice reasons to do it, but there are also, regulatory requirements that you're going to have to meet. So just something to be aware of.
Great points, Yan-Lin. Thanks for that. And certainly we do see, I'm not being an expert on product design, but we do see that amongst a lot of companies that they may not necessarily talk to just a single physician, but just a very small cluster of end users within Singapore, for example. They only talk to hospitals in Singapore without recognizing differences in practices in other parts of the world, as you highlighted. So a great point. I wanted to change topics slightly. It's we only have about 20 minutes to go, so there are a few other things we wanted to cover. Let me turn to Rahul and talk just very briefly about cybersecurity at a high level. We very often hear that medtech and the healthcare industry in general is really struggling to catch up with other major industry verticals. And what therefore in your view can and should a medtech founder, chief executive do about this, and how can cybersecurity be incorporated in the product design process?
It's a really interesting paradox, right? Because on one hand, the healthcare industry is ripe for digitization and capturing value from patient data. Yet it's we find most companies treat cybersecurity as an afterthought, and therefore when they start penetration testing on their cybersecurity, they find a lot of holes. So a few practical tips here. So first, right, again, specify early in the design process what it is that you're trying to protect. So what data needs to be protected, needs to remain confidential, what needs to be authenticated and secure, identifying and using that a risk-based approach. So conducting risk analysis upfront as you design the architecture of the device and the information flow. And so this comes back to then first principles of knowing, well, what are you going to do with that data? Where are you acquiring it from? How is it being sensed or acquired through the device? Where's it being routed to? Who's going to view it? Under what circumstances? And being able to map out those information flows early. And then in that map, understanding where the risks might fall, who might be able to inadvertently view things or purposely hack. And then there are all sorts of software approaches and encryption approaches and systems approaches to deal with those risks. So it's an entirely solvable problem. The challenge often is, especially early stage companies, don't identify those problems to begin with. So if you can do that early in your process, then you've got a good path. If you haven't done it yet, that's also okay. Many companies are going through that journey. Find cybersecurity experts who can do sort of a system-wide assessment of where the gaps are and then what to do to mitigate them. And it's all navigatable, but it needs attention and time.
Great point. Thank you. Thank you for that, Rahul. Quick question for Yan-Linh. I was meant to ask this earlier. It's more about the relationship between a product design contractor and a client or a startup. How do you normally work on IP? Who owns it? What's typically your agreement with clients?
Yeah, so for us, it's very straightforward. Basically, if the client pays their bills, the IP belongs to them, so long as it's arising IP as part of the project. All the background IP obviously belongs to whoever created it before the project started. Now, so our firm, this is the only way that we work, and it's very straightforward. But that's not always true for all product development firms. So it is something that you should check before you decide which partner you go with. There are firms that do take a stake in the IP, but may give you basically a discount on sort of the project itself. And so there's different ways of dealing with IP, even in the product development consultancy world. So it's definitely something to check and pick the partner that suits your business model.
Yeah, great feedback. And again, to our cohort, we will have a separate webinar on this important topic of IP, so we'll tackle that in more detail. Another big topic that we can only touch on relatively at a relatively high level during today's webinar is AI, and I'll turn to Rahul maybe on this. First, as we look both going back to last year's cohort and our cohort before then, the vast majority of our medtech innovator cohort companies have some AI element in their products or their solutions. And so from your perspective, from a product design professional, what are some of the key considerations or best practices perhaps that you would encourage companies to think about?
That's a fantastic question, and we've been quite active over a number of years now, architecting and implementing AI and ML techniques in a variety of medical devices, as well as regulatory cleared devices. And yes, AI ML techniques are quite powerful, and they can really drive a lot of value. But it comes back to first principles, and let me explain what I mean. We see a lot of companies treating AI not necessarily as enabling technology, but as the silver bullet to conquer a problem. It's just another enabling technology. And what's most important is understanding clinically what is trying to be achieved. We see a lot of challenges in the use of AI and ML in how the black box is actually trained. How well, let's make it real. Let's take a colorectal procedure, a flexible endoscope in a GI procedure. It can have an optics stack. It has a lens. It has illumination. and it perhaps maybe uses AR ML techniques to enhance the image through super resolution, let's say. The challenge becomes, how have you trained that? And clinically, how have you tagged all the features you're looking at? How has a company gone through all the corner cases? How do you know that you're not just training it on an average scene of the colon versus actually what's cancer and what's not? Have you clinically validated, can you actually detect cancer? And if you can, is that what stage? These are all really important questions that actually are not solved by AI or ML specialists. They're solved by AI and ML specialists working with optical teams, working with image processing teams, working with a strong set of clinical teams who can stitch that all together. So I think my best advice to companies that are employing AI in their products, treat AI as just one enabling technology in your entire architecture and take a systems approach. If it's a technology push for AI, you'll run into trouble and you'll spend a lot of time and resources chasing ghosts. And it's something you want to avoid.
Great point. Thanks, Rahul. We can talk a lot more about AI, but I think we'll need to move on here. That's very, very helpful. Yanlin, I wanted to ask you. There's increasingly a move from in hospital to care delivered in the home setting. What are some of the things to keep in mind when you're developing a device for a home setting that would be very different from working on a device that's operated by a medical professional?
That's different, again, unfortunately, regulatory standards. I've been saying that word quite a lot, but unfortunately it's true. So as you alluded to, medical professional versus lay user. So your user inputs are going to be really different in terms of what is acceptable, right? How easy it is to use is relative to the amount of training that person has on the machine. So at a lay person level, you probably have to assume something like 8th grade education level, right? And maybe, before they take home the device, they may have 10 minutes, 15 minutes of training before they are sent home with it. Now, for simple devices like now, we've all had ART tests, those rapid antigen kits at home. Those have been 20, 30 years in the making, and have been simplified to such a point that, widely say most people know how to work that. But dialysis machines are going home now more and more often. And that's a very different risk profile. You get that wrong, you're going to get infection. And, you get that wrong, you may not actually do any dialysis, but you think you have. And that's, you could cause sort of systemic shutdown in your body. So then the risk profile goes up and you have a lot more to think about. So quite often when you push it to a home use scenario, it is a higher risk category. There's a lot more human factors and UX, type considerations to consider. And for the manufacturer, so the company that is providing that equipment, it also presents a after-sales logistical headache. So that's something to be aware of. It doesn't stop once you sell the product. Now, anytime the end user has an issue, you need to be able to answer their questions and solve it 24/7. If it's something as critical as a dialysis machine where that person needs to use it every day, you can't just say, oh, call me after the weekend, right? So then you need 24/7 sales support and potentially in-person sales support to fix issues. So then you need to think about, okay, I need to fundraise for quite a large, after sales care team. So all those considerations should be built into your business model when you go out and say, okay, that's the first market I'm going to tackle. There's very good reason why I want to do that, but you need to set expectations with your investors early and fundraise accordingly, because it usually does mean it's a more expensive build, it's a longer time to market, and you probably need even a larger team to support the after sales than an in-clinic device.
That's really good feedback. Thanks, thanks, Jan-Lin. It is a fundamentally different approach, and companies obviously need to realize that very early on. I wanted to go back to Rahul for a second here and talk a bit about connectivity and interoperability, and I'll turn to Langston maybe for some of your thoughts on this as well in a minute. Most medical devices today are connected somehow, but interoperability continues to be a big challenge, and especially in the OR, where obviously you do a lot of work, and between OR and ICU and other parts of the hospital. What are some of the best practices in your view, and perhaps if there's an example that you can think of how this has been executed particularly well?
It's a great question, and interoperability can mean different things as well, right?
True.
So on one level, interoperability between different devices from the same company has lower hurdles because a single large organization can architect those systems to talk to each other. You'd be surprised how many companies are still struggling with that. And that's because they're dealing with legacy devices that have different communication channels, different complexity. If you try to have devices just simply talk wirelessly in the operating room, Wi-Fi doesn't work very well, nor does 5G. So how do you actually overcome infrastructure challenges? But I think what you mean by interoperability is the ability to take insights and data across different stages of a care episode.
Right.
And so that we're seeing a larger trend, and it's in the early days, but we're seeing a larger trend of larger strategics considering these ecosystems and how they architect these digital ecosystems. Now, the challenge is many of them have legacy devices, and how those are upgraded and how they will be launched in the right cadence with their existing products and the partnerships that they're willing to make with their collaborators and to some extent their competitors. The challenge is not technology in that case. It's the business drive for different organizations to partner to agree on the right technical standards, but also the right value creation amongst those partners to then solve big healthcare problems. I'll say one thing though. There is one company that I think has been pursuing interoperability from the start, and that's BrainLab. So some of you may be familiar with them. They are a surgical navigation company that has focused largely on software and insights during surgical navigation. They set out to have an architecture that was purposely interoperable with the leading medical device companies of the world. It took them a long time to build that value proposition, and the industry probably wasn't ready for it in the early days. But they're doing some really amazing things. And I think that's a really good roadmap for taking the long-term view for creating such an ecosystem, living into that, sticking true to your values. For early stage companies, this is where there's a potential for disruption. So when you are designing your product, make sure you're thinking about the ecosystem around it. And from a practical perspective, you may not be able to implement that entire digital ecosystem on day one of launch. But if you've got the hooks to do that and your investors can see that over time, it also generates incredible value for your company long-term.
Great points. Thanks, Rahul. Langston, your device, is it connected, or do you plan to have it connected to other devices? And have you started to consider interoperability, or is an entire standalone device that? And if so, what is that? If that's a conscious decision, how did you make that?
Well, right now we intend to have it more like a standalone device as of now, because we actually have early conversation with authorities at US FDA in particular about like how they see our combination products. Let alone being a very novel technology, there's no precedent case of using ultrasound for delivery of drugs into the eye. So we want to minimize the complexity on how we design the clinical validations process to say substantiate the claims or the intended use that we plan to pursue. let alone, incorporating, say, the latest trend about maybe, AI or, the interoperability functions. So right now we have made the decision to make it rather simple. So to secure early approvals being our first mission. And we'll gradually, based on, say, the user requirements or feedbacks, then we'll incorporate the new features when we see fit. So that's why then we can focus on tackling the key issues first. Otherwise, we'll be like, spread too thin and be addressing a lot of issues, which in great depth, and that might get us nowhere because we'll be, heavily into all these different fronts. Yeah.
Right, makes sense, Langston. Thanks. We have only about 5 minutes left. Maybe before I ask for your sort of closing tips and thoughts. We did have a question from the cohort about the for a startup that's based here in Asia Pacific. What are the pros and cons of having your R&D and engineering physically located in Asia Pacific? If you're working with an outsourcing partner, is it important that they are nearby physically so you can visit one another? So is geographical proximity important, or other benefits of just having it done here in the region, maybe because you can leverage a lower talent pool or lower cost infrastructure? And maybe Yan-Lin, I'll turn to you on this first.
I think there are many reasons why you might do it one way or the other. And I think that's specific to each company. So what I'm going to talk about are just very generalized concepts. So I do know startups who move to one location or another to access funding. That used to be the common thing. So the investors want to see your face. That was a common saying, and so people would pull up routes and park where their VCs were located, or park in the markets where the VCs have more influence. So if there's China VC and they have a large network, for downstream sales and marketing, then I've seen companies basically move just for that reason. And that is a valid reason, because building networks and things is not an insignificant concern. But in terms of if that wasn't an issue and you have international investors and they're sort of dotted everywhere and they're happy, then it's quite often market driven. Where is the place that you're going to make the most money from your product? Which markets are you trying to address with your solution? And some of the solutions are better suited for Asian market, emerging market, and some are better suited for a North American market. And so that really comes down to the specifics of the individual company product pipeline. And the reasons for moving it closer to where your market is access to key opinion leaders, access to the population that you're going to do your human factors, and get basically your design gets influenced by being close to that to the end users. And then finally, the third one is the talent pool question, right? So we are obviously a firm that specializes in acquiring talent, and what I would say is, yes, there are different hotspots for different types of talent globally, but especially when you're talking about potentially working with a product development firm, what we've definitely found out is most of our clients are not where we are physically located. So even pre-pandemic. Probably half our company is based in Cambridge, UK, but not half our clients are based in Cambridge, UK. They're not even, let's say, even in the UK necessarily. They're very global. And the global way of working, so long as you have processes in place, so everybody's on the right track and can track things, and you move towards together on a schedule, actually that's more than fine. You do not have to be co-located with your partners in order to work well. But it does take rigor, which means you need project managers or program managers who can manage different time zones and make sure everybody is still aligned. So that is, I think, the critical importance, rather than I have to co-locate everybody here. And then, of course, during the pandemic, we saw everybody work from home, and they're already a sort of scattered workforce, and people still manage to make that work. So that's more evidence, I would say, that yes, it is entirely possible to not be co-located and do good projects. That being said, still try as much as possible to build a good relationship with all the people that you're working with, because that does help relationships day to day. So if it is possible to meet once in a while face to face, take those opportunities, because there's no, there's some things you can't say on Zoom, right? And those relationships are built in person.
Very good. Thanks for that, Yan-Lin. Time is up. This has been a great discussion. We've covered a number of interesting topics that we could talk a whole lot more about. Let's just wrap up by asking each of our panelists to maybe say a few closing words. Any remaining tips or thoughts on this topic and reflecting what we talked about today? And how can our cohort companies contact you if they have an interest to do so? Perhaps I can even ask you, if you're willing to just give your email in the chat. I think they'd be more than happy to reach out to you. So any final closing thoughts? And I'll start with Langston.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I would say I would just keep it short. I know the journey of developing a product could be ambiguous, not to mention challenging. I think if this is where you're in the crossroad of deciding what to do next. I think going back to QMS as the spirit, not just strictly abiding to all these say guidelines and wordings, but as a spirit to more like to guide you through. I think that will help you sort out what are the key things that you should focus and how to have a more holistic perspective to consolidate your efforts to do the product development work, so you don't miss out, say, human factors or some other very important design inputs that you have to consider upfront. So I would strongly encourage you to go back to this as your foundation to move forward.
Terrific. Thank you, Langston. Rahul?
Make sure you have clarity around what your Gen 1 product is and then what your Gen 2 or Gen 3 future roadmap might be. We see too many companies try to bite off too much on the first go and effectively over-engineer and spend a ridiculous amount of time, energy, resources chasing rabbit holes. So it takes a lot of discipline to have clarity on what your Gen 1 is, back to your value proposition, back to users. But if you can do that, then you have a more efficient path.
Great advice. Thank you. Yan-Lin?
I would say it takes a village. Most of the stuff that I know the cohort is working on can probably be categorized as deep tech. One really smart individual, or even two really smart individuals, usually that's not enough to get to market. Realize that it takes a whole ecosystem of folks, a team, effectively, to do these things. You need lots of different disciplines, and sort of not being afraid to ask for help or to gain new resources from individuals that have different experiences will probably help you accelerate on the journey, rather than trying to sort of hoard knowledge in-house amongst a very small number of individuals. Because a lot of these things that we talked about today, these are sort of the solved parts, how to get through regulatory, how to do human factors, how to do cybersecurity. These are things that people in the world already know how to do. And so there's no use trying to re-engineer specific to your, to learn it all yourself and do it all yourself. You should focus your energies on the things that nobody else can do, which is the thing that makes you special as a startup, right? And where you are able to get help externally, do so, because that usually accelerates your journey and means that you don't have to learn everything from scratch. Makes it much less daunting as well to have a good team around you.
Great advice. Thank you so much. A big thanks to all of our panelists for joining us this morning. This has been a great discussion. We will shortly part ways with our YouTube viewers. I will ask our cohort to stay online, our panelists to stay online. We will move on to our closed door Q&A in just a moment. But for now, those of you who've been watching on YouTube, thank you so much. Tune in again next week when I think we will touch on manufacturing and supply chains, another important topic. So thank you all on YouTube, and we'll disconnect our YouTube live stream now.